Hi guys, potentially a controversial one here. I don't know. There's a thing, an idea that kind of annoys me sometimes. It's to do with the idea of an addict, and obviously there's a variety of different ways of looking at this topic, but the prevailing notion nowadays is of this notion of a kind of helpless addict who has an illness, which is an illness just the same as any other illness, the same as cancer, the same as anything else, and that most of their behaviour up until a certain point of severity has to be looked at through that lens and cannot be looked at in another way. There's a similar kind of vague and kind of nonsensical morality with the topic of suicide, and similarly sometimes with mental health as a sort of buzzword. There's a kind of vague idea of like, this person needs to be looked at in a certain way, and again up until a certain point, a fairly like extreme point, that's just how you have to look at this person. What made me think of this was I was watching Pete Doherty be interviewed by Louis Theroux, and what struck me whilst watching it, and I grew up as a big fan of Pete Doherty's music. I really liked the Libertines. They've got some really great songs, and I grew up kind of having sympathy for him because I saw back then the way he was demonised in the tabloid press, and I felt he was a kind of a misunderstood addict, or that I felt in general that people who took drugs were looked down upon unfairly, and that he was mistreated as such. And now that I'm older, it's not just that I'm older really, but watching this documentary and knowing more about him and his life, watching this documentary, it struck me that he is a very selfish man, and that sometimes with addiction there's a chicken egg quality. Many of us have struggled with addiction. I'm sure a lot of people that watch this channel, due to the nature of it about being about drugs, have struggled with addiction. I've struggled with it, not to the same extent that Pete Doherty has, obviously, or at least I certainly haven't indulged it to the same extent that Pete Doherty has. That does not necessarily, in my opinion, mean that force of addiction is not present in me to the same degree. And I felt watching it that there was very little about how these things affected other people. It seemed to be quite self-oriented, which is fine. It was about him. He's a celebrity. He's an interesting guy and everything else. And we're all self-absorbed. That's normal. But I know for a fact, even without knowing this, being involved in his personal life, I know for a fact, just based on just human nature, that his addiction problems have caused his mother endless pain. Probably until, or even still, I'm sure now, but probably for the majority of his adult life, for decades, his mother has probably been in agony and constant stress and constant worry about him. It was also revealed in this documentary that he has 3 kids now. He has 2 other kids from before, and he wasn't really involved in their lives. Of course, there's all the drama with his band. He caused his bandmates a huge amount of pain and problems and discomfort, and he caused himself a lot of problems and discomfort, although I would say that he probably hurt himself significantly less than he hurt others, because he was able to numb the pain of this with heroin and crack and everything else, and his mother, for example, I assume was not using hard drugs, and was just left to deal with the constant worry that any day now her son was either going to get hauled off to prison again, or there were actually humiliating photos and stories about him in the paper, or he was going to die. And most of us during that time who followed him felt fairly strongly that he was going to die. And where this clashes with the conventional kind of addict narrative, well, it doesn't do that, does it? It does this. Where it clashes with that is, in a number of ways. I mean, that's assuming that you even buy into that in the first place, and we're sort of told, oh, this is just science. This is just a scientific fact. It is not and will never be a scientific fact that having a predisposition towards addiction is the same as cancer. It's not. You cannot defeat cancer with willpower. You can defeat an addiction with willpower, even if you are extremely genetically predisposed to addiction. You can defeat it with willpower. It's just a fact. You cannot will your way out of cancer. And if you're saying that you cannot defeat an addiction with willpower, you cannot overcome your genetic predisposition towards addiction, then you are telling people, give up, don't bother, don't try and get clean from hard drugs, there's no point, you're incapable of it. That's not a positive message. It never will be. It will never be right to tell people that, and I don't care what the science says, it's bullshit. The science doesn't say that, and if it does, it's flawed science. Scientific studies with inevitable biases and often pandering towards progressivism, they will never supersede basic, simple observations and common sense. They just won't. It's far more corruptible, and there's just a sort of irrefutable common sense argument there that you can't get round. It's wrong, in my opinion, to talk about people in that way, and it makes me angry, like that people are so often spoken about in that way. And what is ultimately so hypocritical about it, or contradictory rather, is that it's only up until a point. Because you can say, oh, he did all of this, he put his family through absolute hell and torture. That was fine though, because he's an addict and you don't understand because he's an addict, so he's hurting and he's ill and you have to be understanding. All right, well, when someone takes loads of meth and they rape a kid, no one says that. So what happens to this science on addiction then? We only make those arguments up until a certain point. It's the same with mental illness. Oh, this person can be horrible to their family and mistreat their family because they're mentally ill. Okay, well then what about evil dictators who are clearly mentally ill? It's okay because they're mentally ill. We have to be understanding. We have to be sympathetic. And because someone's mentally ill, they don't have willpower. Is that correct? If someone is an addict, that means they don't have willpower anymore. It's not true. I'm not saying we shouldn't be understanding of people who are addicted to things. Of course, I would not, from someone who's deep in the throes of heroin addiction, I would not expect the same standard of behaviour that I would expect from someone who wasn't. There are certain things you would, if someone like that was in your life, there are certain things, of course, you would tolerate. There's a lot that you would tolerate and try to be understanding of and patient about. But you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't be told that that's the only correct way to think, and you shouldn't be told that there's almost no limit to that, and that your pain is infinitely less important than their addiction. It's not right. It's crazy. And so reading the comments, I kind of wasn't surprised. I guess probably partially because they're his fans, but everybody was sympathising with him and saying, oh, it's so good that he's still alive and he's such a sensitive man. Why is he sensitive exactly? Because he writes poems and speaks French and, used to cut himself and stuff. Like, I'm not sure that really makes him sensitive. I think being sensitive means caring deeply about other people's feelings and often putting them before your own. I don't think it's right the way we talk about people like that. And again, as I say, I know that's the prevailing view now. I know that also very recently there was a very different atmosphere in the tabloids, and that was terrible. I mean, like there are stories like Amy Winehouse, for example, and you can't look at that and not have sympathy for her. And I know that their stories are very similar, but there are some quite key differences as well. And the thing, I guess, that the most significant factor for me watching this Pete Doherty documentary, not documentary, it's Louis Theroux interview, was that he got clean from heroin because of an ultimatum from his wife. And he is now drinking a lot and eating very heavily. He's enormous. And he looks like he's very unhealthy, and he seems like he could die. He could have a heart attack. He must be extremely weak from all the years of abuse he's put his body through. And he said, I just want to hear my daughter's first words, and then I'm not going to live much longer than that. He is essentially saying that like cheese and biscuits and wine are more important than his daughter. And for any argument anyone can make about you don't understand how hard it is, he's got so much pain, he can't help it, his daughter is going to grow up with the knowledge that her dad chose those things over her, and that her dad, in her mind certainly, this is how she will almost definitely see it, did not love her enough to make those choices, to make the right choices. That is most of the time our children internalise that, and even if they don't, it's terrible to have to grow up without a parent because they didn't want to control themselves. I've seen this in people, and I mean, if then we're unable, if we don't have freedom of choice, and then why praise someone when they do something good, or when an addict does get clean? What do you say then? If it's not possible, then what do you say to all the people who do it for their families? We're supposed to eradicate the meaningfulness of their stories and turn everything into this blank slate of, or this just black and white portrait of addict, this binary understanding of how people work. And we're to eradicate all of the amazing things people accomplish through willpower and courage and commitment and love. And we're supposed to eradicate all that in favour of an argument that says you are essentially like a robot. You just cannot help yourself. You're like an animal, and nothing you do is your fault. And you can keep eating this way, and no one's going to take the food and slap it out of your hand and order you to stop and tell you you're a disgrace because you're an addict. It's just mind-blowing to me. Again, I totally think we should be sensitive and understanding towards people, and I don't think, I'm not suggesting some kind of draconian world where addicts are treated like shit and where you're punished really severely for taking drugs or anything like that. And I think there's so many people who are addicts who are traumatized and in pain and suffering, and are, even if technically they have a choice, even if technically they could stop, there are people who they're living on the streets, they have nothing, they've never had anybody, nobody's ever loved them, they've got deep psychological wounds, and the only thing that makes sense to them and probably will ever make sense is addiction and drugs. And I fully have sympathy for those people. It's really sad. But they're all individuals. They're not all the same. And we're lumping them all in as the same and saying a guy who went to fancy rehabs and who's had loads of people who've loved him and tried to help him and supported him and worried about him. He's had clear-headed moments of more or less enforced sobriety where he's had a moment to stop and say, I've caused so much pain. When I look ahead of me, I see that I can cause so much more, and I'm free from this particularly severe addiction now, and now I owe it to people around me to do something better. They're not all the same, and the choices that addicts are faced with are not always the same. some people are just complete victims of circumstance, and some people make others victims of their selfish choices. Ultimately, like drugs often make people feel really nice, and that's why they take them, and they don't want to feel bad, and their feelings are more important than other people's feelings, and they lose a sense of obligation and duty, or maybe they never had it in the first place. And when you have a baby, you have a lot more responsibility than just, I'm going to be around to hear her first words. You have a responsibility to look after that person, and really these days well into adulthood, unfortunately. Not that it should be that way, but at least until they get there. And you should want to be around for as long as possible anyway. It's a blessing to have people that love you, and to have a child, and to have a roof over your head, and to throw all of that away because you don't want to control your impulses is always sad, and sometimes something that I think is worthy of a lot more judgment than it receives. But it's a subject you have to handle with, kid gloves. And I don't think that's right at all, personally. I think for all the sort of, for anyone who his initial reaction to this, maybe that, that I should have more understanding or more empathy for addicts. I personally feel that the world should have more understanding and empathy for the people around them who have to tolerate them and worry about them. And I've been on both ends of that, and I fully own my choices. I'm grateful for when I've had understanding, when people have said, "It's okay, I know you were depressed and you were drinking a lot, and you were suffering." I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful that sometimes the world will say, not specifically to me, but generally the message is, this wasn't entirely your fault, and you weren't entirely yourself, and you were going through something that we're all, most of us at least, capable of going through, that can make it really hard to think straight and for your feelings to be in the right place. I'm grateful for that understanding, but I would never, ever, ever want someone to take away my perceived sort of agency or independence to a point where what I do doesn't even matter, and where I'm just a completely useless prisoner of one of my many competing instincts. That's not right at all, in my opinion. Yeah. So that's all. Let me know your thoughts and feelings. Thanks for watching, guys. See you soon.